What is an egoist? What is an altruist? What does spiritual teaching know about the two poles? About the often mentioned interplay between egoistic behavior and altruism? Billy might like to take up this issue in a bulletin and make statements in the spirit of God. Basically, I do not want to be premature, because this topic will certainly be dealt with again and again in further bulletins. Nevertheless, a summary or specification by Billy could clarify the situation. I would be pleased about that, because in many FAQ articles, especially in connection with overpopulation, selfish behavior is found as a cause, or I personally feel torn between these two poles and sometimes feel helpless in the face of accusations my own and those of others, and it seems that the many clever minds who have been thinking about this topic for decades, and whose explanations are available for reading on the net, do not agree either. Perhaps you would like to pass on my request or suggestion to Billy. Thanks for your efforts.
Egoism as a purely negative personal state is an addiction that is given as selfishness, although it should be noted that there is also a purely positive selfishness of personal form. If, however, egoism is usually spoken of Greek/Latin ego, me, then the meaning is that of selfishness, further also in a negative sense, ego-relatedness, ego-addiction, selfishness and negative self-love. An egoist who is to be understood in a purely negative sense is therefore selfish, even psychopathic, and always sees himself only in the first place, so that from this point of view, he is also a human being who exercises power over other beings, and in certain circumstances, even to the point of violence and coercion. But if he does not achieve what he wants to achieve for his own benefit, then he can be cowardly and insulted and go his own way, but only in order to distinguish himself in terms of his egoism, to satisfy his selfishness and selfishness. When we speak and judge in this sense, we are referring to a human being's absolute self-centeredness, because we are acting solely for the benefit of our own personality without any consideration for our fellow human beings. The possibility that other human beings may be burdened or hurt in their thoughts, feelings or psychology is completely irrelevant for the purely negative egoist, because only his own, and effectively, everything and anything about himself is important to him. Not all egoism is the same, because there are different forms of egoism, which are consequently called egoisms, plural, and correspond to ways of acting where only the actor himself determines the maximum of action. As a rule, the relevant actions are determined unreservedly solely by the actor's own advantage. However, if this own advantage is to be classified in a symbiotic attitude to life, which is also for the benefit and advantage of other human beings, then this form of action is ethically fully legitimate. As a rule, however, it is the case that the human beings who are egoists are understood as short-sightedly acting greedy egotists who can hardly or not at all accept it when other people show themselves to them as greedy as they themselves act. The greedy egoist thus grants himself much more or even all the freedoms than he grants his fellow human beings. Egoism is therefore usually understood in a pejorative way as a synonym for completely ruthless behavior and judged as indecent. The term then describes the attitude of pursuing exclusively external personal interests without consideration for the interests of other human beings or even at their expense. In this context, egoism is criticized as the opposite of altruism and solidarity. However, this is only true if the inner benefit is not taken into account when assessing egoistic actions. Conversely, there is the view that altruism must be possible only through the attainment of one's own good, analogous to the rule that applies to rescue operations, namely that self-protection is the first measure of first aid. Freely, according to the biblical saying, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. If the negative view of egoism is seen as egomania, it is in contrast to healthy egoism. The non-judgmental view is the factual assertion of psychological egoism, which shows that all the human beings would act de facto egoistically. Equally value-free is the economic model of Homo economicus, which corresponds to a model conception of economic theory and embodies the human beings who think and act exclusively according to economic principles. He knows only economic goals and is particularly characterized by qualities such as rational behavior and the pursuit of maximizing benefits. He is oriented towards a complete knowledge of his economic decision-making possibilities, as well as their consequences, and the complete information regarding all markets and characteristics of all goods, and thus towards complete market transparency. Homo economicus as an ideal serves to be able to describe elementary economic interrelationships in a clear and transparent manner and without practical shortcomings. The human beings who do exactly that which may harm others as a result of their selfish behavior are considered to be egoists. They win by doing so, are always considered to be the most important person, and want to have the biggest piece of every pie. It is often big things, but often also only small things, that the egoist can be recognized by when he ruthlessly makes sure that he gets what he wants. The egoist is also egocentric, so there is really no difference in the basic meaning between egoism and egocentricity, rarely also egocentrism or egocentricity. But if you are only ever concerned with your own advantage, sooner or later you will fail. The false, selfish egoism begins in childhood. The child, who always and everywhere receives only the supposed best from parents who have no upbringing needs, without having to make any special effort to do so, easily and quickly develops into the human beings who, regardless of losses, make their own will and above all their wishes the yardstick for all their farewells, and for all things, situations and incidents they are confronted with in life. And this happens because he learns about egoism at a young age and becomes selfish and self-centered, and as a result, he also succumbs hopelessly to egocentrism, false self-love, selfishness, self-centeredness, ego addiction and selfishness. If there is talk of egoism in a negative sense, then this is the absolute self-centeredness in which the thoughts, feelings, actions and behavior of the individual are only used for the benefit of the person, without any consideration of whether the fellow human beings suffer mental, emotional, or psychological damage, or even professional, interpersonal or material damage. With all that has been explained so far, however, healthy egoism, which is quite justified in certain situations, is in no way meant. Healthy egoism is a positive quality that has always been part of life. Every human being wants, and rightly so, of course, to secure a good place in life, whether at school, at work or in leisure time, and so on. A human being who has a healthy egoism and is able to assert himself, and who, at the same time, also knows his limits and has learned to accept them, will also give his fellow human beings the freedom to develop themselves, will not selfishly pester them, will not take advantage of them, will not exploit them in any way or force them to do anything. To gain self-knowledge and to bring about a healthy, positive self-realization is always a form of healthy egoism, but it cannot be in any way connected with negative egoism. Therefore, if the human beings want to lead a personally successful life, they must not be led astray by the false opinion of their fellow human beings that they are acting selfishly. In fact, if he wants to realize himself, he must have a certain positive egoism. In this sense, the human beings who do not understand the forms of egoism are wrong to regard it as something bad. To gain self-knowledge and strive for self-realization means to be selfish in a positive way. In this respect, it is a fact according to the clearance that more than 88% of all human beings let themselves be guided by external influences in their actions and deeds as well as in their behavior. This is because very few human beings lead their lives the way they actually want to. The majority of humanity, however, leads a life that they do not really want. This because they are of the mistaken opinion that they are selfish if they do what they think is fundamentally correct. But this is founded in early education, because it was wrongly learned that egoism is only something bad, negative, shameful and bad and reprehensible, whereby it is not learned that there is also a positive and vital egoism. This is just in contrast to the negative egoism, which is learned from early childhood through a wrong upbringing. So it is because of the wrong understanding of egoism that people often say yes, even if they want to say no. As a result of this, The human beings are always and again stuck back and give in, talk and act against their own opinion and adapt themselves fearlessly to other human beings who have a different opinion and demand something different than what is actually wanted. But if the human beings seemingly behave as selflessly as they think they do, by pleasing the other human beings around them, then they are also selfish. He then wants to achieve through his selfless behavior that the other human beings continue to speak well of him, which is of course also true for the human beings in general, who he expects to be good and kind to him. So he is afraid that his reputation might suffer or that his fellow man might turn away from him. Consequently, he does not orientate himself towards his fellow man for the sake of his fellow man, but towards himself for his own sake, and this is of course also selfish. If the human beings were not afraid, they would, so they think erroneously, lose their prestige, because they would then be doing exactly what they think is correct, what their own view and opinion is, and what they think is good. Basically, the human beings are selfish in one way or another, whether they are normally positive or negative. To take care of oneself in a good way with regard to one's own self-realization, and so on, or to believe in oneself and to lead one's life as it wants to be led in a normal positive way is a form of healthy positive egoism. A selfish behavior is only harmful or unhealthy if it causes other human beings to be abused and exploited for their own benefit. But if the human beings do and say that they were correct and carry it within them as their own opinion, and if they also make use of their personal right in this respect, namely to lead their life as they want to lead it, without harming or exploiting another person, then they are selfish in the normal positive sense. It really is worth considering what the whole of humanity would have been like today if there had not been human beings of good normal positive form who have achieved a great deal and advanced the earthly human cultures, be they great thinkers, discoverers, inventors, philosophers, prophets, artists, scientists or researchers and so on. The humanity of the earth has only become what it is today because it had relied on all these great human beings who listened to their inner voice telling them to do all that they were urged to do by their normal positive selfishness. If all those inventors, researchers, artists, philosophers, prophets and scientists had listened to their critics and scoffers, then today the earthly humanity would not be in a time of high development of technology, medicine, and general science and so on, but would still be crawling around in caves and hitting their skulls with stones. This means that progress is really only possible if there are people who have a healthy positive egoism and stand by what they consider correct, even if they meet with criticism and incomprehension from those human beings whose intelligence, understanding and reason is not yet so far advanced that they can understand the healthy, normal, positive egoistic striving of those who bring progress in all things as well as love, knowledge, wisdom and humanity among the peoples. Therefore the question is aloud here, which human beings are most respected and admired, whether they are those who openly and honestly stand by their views and opinions and in this way also go their own way through life, even if they meet with unreasonable and offensive criticism, or those human beings who only speak to the mouth of their fellow human beings and let their flag flutter in their wind. A human being who does what he thinks is correct and what also corresponds to his opinion is usually more successful than those human beings who give into the opinions of others and do everything to satisfy them. This kind of human beings belongs to those who endlessly chase success, never achieve it, and are consequently dissatisfied. However, the human beings who are successful and hold their own opinions are usually much more satisfied than those who are guided by the opinions of others. Every personal and material success in life depends to a great extent on self-determination and self-realization, because if the human beings want to lead a personally and materially successful life, they must not be led astray by the opinions of their fellow human beings, but they must follow their own inner voice and do what they consider to be correct and important in a positive and logical way. Indeed, the first duty of the human beings is to know themselves, to realize themselves and to make themselves happy and joyful, so that they can be themselves, know who they are truthful and can honestly say I am effectively myself and therefore I am. This corresponds to a normal, healthy egoism. And if the human beings cannot talk about themselves in this way, then their life is not worth a thing. In the end, every human being can only make himself a true human being through normal, healthy egoism, because only he alone has influence on himself. Of course, there will always be the human beings who find themselves clever in this respect, and who reject everything that others have worked and learned, say and do in a positive way with regard to self-knowledge and self-realization. And this is done because the antagonists do not like it in their arrogance and know-it-all attitude, and therefore disregard those who consciously and honestly strive for themselves and for their true humanity. But such critics are negative, egoistic, so no monument can be erected to their stupidity and false criticism. The accusation that someone is egoistic is therefore egoistic in the highest degree, and in this form the term egoism is usually used in a completely negative way. But there is, as explained, also a healthy egoism, in which both one's own personality and other human beings can very well be thought of. In healthy egoism, therefore, the human beings think both of themselves and of their fellow human beings. For the human beings who do not know the difference between negative and positive egoism, or who are not understanding in this respect, this may at first seem like a contradiction, but in reality it is not. The fact is that only the human beings who also think of themselves and their needs and do not neglect them, live in a state of farewell and contentment. And only then, if this is so, can they also think of the well-being and contentment of their fellow human beings. However, if he constantly has thoughts and feelings that he is missing something, then he has thought-feeling psychological impulses that he is missing something, so he is always searching for the missing parts of his life. If the human beings do not consider their needs and wishes and so on in any way, then they suffer just as much harm as if they selfishly think only of themselves and the fulfillment of their own needs and wishes. If all thought-feeling psychological behavioral forms of the human beings are considered in this way, then basically everything and every behavior is selfish in some form, even in a negative or positive way. Thus it is that when the human beings put aside their own interests and needs, and work positively for the welfare and satisfaction and so on of their fellow human beings, they act just as selfishly as when they only act negatively, and only see advantages which they can gain through their selfishness. When egoism is defined, it is usually done in the way that it is said and meant you are egoistic. But this corresponds to a remark which on the one hand points to the corresponding behavior of the human beings and which is mostly used to show another person that he is just mentally and emotionally selfish and also acts accordingly. On the other hand, the remark you are selfish can also be used to manipulate the human beings. The other person should feel guilty by making a remark in this regard, which is intended to turn him away from his own interests and to turn to those who egotistically want to take advantage of it. In fact, there is no reason to feel guilty when someone is accused of selfishness, or told that he or she is unreasonable or stubborn. Accusations of this kind only serve the purpose of manipulation through feelings of guilt. It must be absolutely clear, however, that such selfish statements and remarks can never be evaluated personally, because the personality of the human beings is outwardly absolutely taboo and therefore unassailable, and therefore cannot be manipulated. It is therefore completely wrong to assume that a human being can personally perceive, understand and accept something if he is attacked in any verbal way, because the personality of the human being is an individual and original factor which can only be influenced by himself in his own way, but never by verbal attacks and so on of any fellow human beings. Many human beings talk about taking something personal in certain situations, in certain events, speeches, accusations and insults and so on. However, this is an expression of unreasonableness and not understanding what can effectively be personal. For example, when a human being is insulted, beaten, cheated or otherwise harmed by another person, whether physically, psychologically, verbally, or in terms of material values, this has nothing to do with the person's own personality, but is solely a behavioral thing which causes him or her suffering, pain or harm and so on. However, the whole of the attack, no matter what kind, does not and never concerns the personality but also only the body, the behavior and actions as well as the views, opinions, habits and material values and so on. The real thing, the personal, cannot be attacked. insulted or harmed in this process, because the personal is the personality itself, which is embedded in its entirety in the consciousness, thoughts and feelings, the psyche, the subconscious and memory, as well as in the unconscious forms, and therefore cannot be affected by verbal or violent attacks. Thus, if external attacks occur in a verbal or physically violent way as well as in a purely material way, there can be no attack on the personality and the forms associated with it. What is personal in and with the human beings and embodies their personality, with all its secondary values, is therefore inviolable and unassailable in any case. Only a stupid and unrealistic idea can lead to the assumption that one's own personality will be affected as a result of certain things, insults, events, or situations and so on to the outside world, and in the face of all external influences. The personality is therefore absolutely unassailable and taboo, and consequently nothing can be taken personally, no matter what it is. Insults, accusations, violence, actions, deeds and slander are, in any case, only attacks against the honor, integrity, righteousness and dignity of the human being, and therefore the personality of the human beings cannot be attacked, and also nothing can be taken personally. If this were not the case, the human being would not be able to be himself, but would be continuously in the personality clutches of other human beings, which means that he would be directly and unrestrictedly identified and connected with the personality of the others, and consequently, he would not be able to live out his own personality. If a human being would take something personally that another person says or does, then on the one hand, he would identify himself with the respective thing, insult, action, or deed and so on of the other person as well as with the other person himself. Therefore, if such a silly and simple-minded phrase is used in relation to another person's thing, and so on, in the sense that something is taken personally, it is identification with it, which is nothing more than a delusion that very quickly degenerates into a delusion. If the human beings take something personally, as it is said in stupid sayings, such as insulting it, and so on, then they think and act in an unreasonable way, because they identify themselves with the insult and also with the person who insulted them, and consequently they orientate their view towards being in agreement with the insult, or to be one with it and the insulting person. In the same way this happens with situations, views, opinions, actions and deeds and so on which occur in a negative or positive way and which are taken personally or with which the human beings identify themselves instead of accepting, looking at and processing everything in a completely neutral way. The stupid and wrong way of talking about taking something personally because the human beings identifies with something that insults or harms them results in the generation of evil, negative and bad thoughts and feelings, which lead to thoughtless answers and actions and even to violence and psychological damage. The only correct thing for the human beings to do is to identify themselves with nothing at all, and therefore also not to take anything personal that is evil, negative or bad for them, but to take in and process everything and anything, every insult, every event, every situation, every act and action and every word in an absolutely neutral way. And only if this is done in this way, neither anger nor malicious, quarrelsome, or hateful and revengeful thoughts, feelings, actions and deeds will arise. This also ensures that no thought, emotional or emotional excitement is created, that no excitement arises and that the nerves remain calm and controlled. Consequently, in a completely self-controlled state, the insults, actions, deeds and behavior and so on or any things, events or situations of any kind which occur to other human beings can be met calmly and objectively or, if necessary, with a slightly or strongly raised voice.
Altruism. The term altruism alter the other in everyday language means to be unselfish, selfless, sacrificial, self-sacrificing, acting out of pure human love, upskill, noble-minded, generous, magnanimous and noble, as well as to show consideration for other human beings. Altruism is a way of thinking and acting which aims at a deliberate realization of the good of fellow human beings as well as comprehensively also the common good of society and its interests. Altruism, which stands as an antonym to egoism, is thus understood as selflessness, consideration and unselfishness and so on, but it must be remembered that there is no human beings who put their own interests absolutely in the background and are completely selfless, because the instinct of self-preservation and the fulfillment of all necessary needs also correspond to an egoistic form. However, if a human being denies this precisely that he himself is in no way selfish, then he is dishonest towards his fellow human beings and himself and lies. Wrongly, those human beings are also called egoists who do not allow themselves to be exploited ruthlessly and who are anxious to let reason, and logic prevail in this respect, and consequently only give as much and in every respect as they can bear without harming themselves in any way. So when the human beings demand that they let themselves be exploited or simply be helpful beyond their possible measure, then they are themselves selfish to a great extent. Altruistic action is generally equated with selfless action, but this does not take into account the aspect of the goal of the actions which are carried out through selflessness. Furthermore, it must be said that the view that altruistic action leads to positive selflessness and even self-sacrifice is absolutely wrong, religiously conditioned and confused, because such action is no longer altruistic, but corresponds to an addiction and has degenerated into personal self-sacrifice from the latent castigatio, chastisement in relation to a completely misunderstood voluntary deprivation and suffering for the sake of the well-being of another human beings or simply for the sake of a higher good. Instead, selflessness merely emphasizes the postponement of one's own concerns to a personally bearable and not harmful degree. Altruism as a concept is a counter-concept to egoism. The Frenchman Auguste Comte Wikipedia = philosopher. Isidore Marie Auguste Fernous Xavier Comte was a French mathematician, philosopher and critic of religion. Above all, however, he is known as one of the co-founders of sociology, whose name goes back to Comte. Born 19th January 1798, Montpellier, France. Died 5th September 1857, Paris, France. Education École Polytechnique. Parents Rosalie Boyer and Louis Auguste Xavier Comte. Spouse Caroline Masson, married 1825 to 1842. Books Speech on the Spirit of Positivism. Mistakenly or out of incomprehension, altruism is often also called love and contrasted with egoism, which is of course nonsensical, because love is the absolute certainty of living and coexisting in everything, so in everything that exists in fauna and flora, in fellow human beings, in every material and spiritual life form of any kind, and in the existence of the whole universe and beyond. Love, then, is the absolute and unconditional certainty that one lives and coexists in everything that exists in reality and truth, such as in the world of animals and creatures, fauna, and in the world of plants and flora, as well as in the human beings themselves, in every material, solid and spiritual energetic primeval life form and being of any kind, but also in the existence of the universe, the entire heavens and beyond. According to the interpretation of the spiritual doctrine, true love means that the human beings coexist with absolute certainty in everything and every existing thing until the last vibration of their impulses. And to coexist in something means a total and unalterable intimate, unanimous, sympathetic inclination, connectedness and affection, which corresponds to the value of unadulterated and true love. Therefore, if there is true love in a human being for himself as well as for his fellow human beings, the fauna and flora and for everything that exists, then everything vibrates and exists together in uplifting inner and outer pulsating motion of a true certainty of inseparable commonality. Alongside selflessness, altruism is another synonym for altruism, which in social psychology is also known as prosocial behavior. In other words, it means a selfless action for others, but never to the point of self-sacrifice. True altruism, this must be absolutely clear, can only come about and be cultivated through the attainment of one's own well-being in a thought-feeling psychological form. But this can only be effectively the case if all the necessary conditions are given, which are directly connected with the corresponding behavior patterns, as well as with the overall physical health, charity, self-knowledge, self-realization, and with all the material and the possibilities of knowledge, wisdom, understanding, reason and logic. This means that an altruist must have various valuable prerequisites in a purely personal way in order to be altruistically effective. Compared to the egoist, the altruistic preconditions are therefore exactly contrary, that is to say, opposite with regard to different things, following that the state and behavior factors of the egoistic human beings are incompatible with altruism and contradictory to it. The egoistic presuppositions are simply antithetical, antagonistic to altruism. Seen in relation to human beings, altruism is a specialty and therefore not only a morally beautiful trait, but it is basically a very essential, if not the effective survival advantage of the human being species. This is a fact that was already recognized by the original prophet Nokodamian and taught the human beings to master their life together and everything that arises in existence peacefully with each other. He taught that a genus, a group, a species or a people has a higher chance of survival the more often all those who form a group behave in a helpful, caring and selfless manner as a result of self-knowledge and self-realization that has taken place. He spoke of the fact that in human beings everything is predetermined as an urged by the creative natural laws, and that consequently everything altruistic is in human nature, and that consequently the human being can simply be as the innermost being pretends to be if only he wants to, because the ability to do so lies with himself. So he should be nice, fair, helpful and philanthropic without any ulterior motives. In principle the human beings are social beings, therefore they should also act and behave in a dementing way. It is his duty to get along well with his fellow human beings, whereby he should also feel the impulses from within himself that call him to help his fellow human beings. Altruism is an imperative in the human beings throughout the laws of creation and nature, but as a rule he disregards this, so that he very often acts according to his own wrong and selfish judgment with regard to the way of life and indulges in antagonism and selfishness. His whole perception has long been focused on egoism, and especially in the present time of the third millennium, which also means that he has also become attuned to the egoist within himself. As a result, it is more and more evident that egoism is overgrowing altruism, that the human beings are becoming more and more alien and indifferent to each other, and that true, good and positive interpersonal relationships are therefore more and more rare. Literally, the egoists of today are completely out of their species and are causing enormous damage. In fact, selfishness is already so far advanced that the survival of humanity on Earth is in grave danger, the main reason being the criminal overpopulation and all its malicious effects against life and limb and against nature, the planet, the climate and the fauna and flora. Unbridled selfishness is therefore the problem of humanity today, because it is in selfishness that all the evils that dominate humanity and the world today are founded. Human egoism alone prevents a worldwide rigorous birth control in order to reduce the mass of humanity and bring it to a normal and compatible level for the earth and nature. This standard of social criticism is to complain about the increasing social coldness and the triumphant selfishness, completely overlooking the fact that everything is getting worse the more the world population is growing, which today, at the end of 2014, has more than 8.5 billion human beings and continues to grow criminally because the responsible governments are unable to introduce the necessary birth control measures. Especially today, the human beings of the earth believe that everyone is their own neighbor, and in addition, due to the fast pace of life and hectic pace of life, no human being has the energy or time to care for other human beings to any great extent or at all. The fact of the matter is that in the family as well as at school, at work, and in the economy as a whole, competition determines everything and all forms of behavior. This makes it all the more joyful for some human beings to cling falsely to claims that an unimaginable number of helpful people are engaged in absolutely honest and selfless voluntary work, and that countless relatives would sacrifice themselves in caring for sick or disabled family members and those in need of help, and with regard to old people. And time and again, it is claimed, humanity could be uplifted by the moving examples of such assistance to truly selfless human beings. So what is problematic about altruism, apart from a certain small lack of it? The know-it-alls, the stupid, the indifferent and the ignorant ask themselves, because they do not recognize the truth that much of the whole of this helpfulness is not in many cases altruistic, but is based solely on making money and a desire for recognition. Money and image cultivation are therefore often the means of the widespread helpfulness, whether in terms of voluntary work or as a carer, and so on. All too often this helpfulness is simply a desire for self-congratulatory and financial profit, which also includes financial exploitation and legacy hunting. Not to be forgotten are also the motives that lead to that helpfulness out of feelings of guilt, whereby the human beings who have been harmed by something bad or evil or try to make amends by repentant help. These are undeniable facts which, as a rule, are not accepted by the unworldly and uninitiated, because they seem blatant even though they are true. It is this kind of helpers described above that make the reputation of those who are truly honest volunteers doing a heavy duty to fellow human beings, or who are altruistically helpful human beings caring for disabled or sick family members or old people and supporting them in every possible way, step into the mud and bring them into disrepute. Just as some human beings are unrestrainedly selfish and cause tremendous harm, others are tyrannically and unconditionally kind, are honestly and altruistically always ready to listen to others, to help others or to stand up for others or to stand in for them. Some, however, play the role of a wailing wall for burnt out, stressed out people, for those who are bullied, tired of life, toilful people and those who are burdened with sorrow and worry. Others, however, do this in an honest, altruistic, humane way for the sake of pure humanity, for which they hardly ever receive thanks for their humane willingness to help. This strangely altruistic human beings also never get the idea that anyone could be interested in their own problems, which they also carry around with them and which cause them great problems. And so it happens, and this is a fact, that after some time their psychological and physical effects of their ever-ready niceness are felt and they themselves become the needy. This kind of altruists burns out, because they feel empty and selfless in a fatal sense, because they suffer from the niceness sickness that results from the fact that, through a wrong way of thinking, the whole thing of being ready to help is only done to calm their own bad conscience. But this does not correspond to true altruism, but to self-deception. If giving and helping becomes the dominant motive for leading a life, then the human beings disappear into themselves, so to speak, because they gradually identify themselves personally with giving and helping, which means nothing else but that they become a non-person. This happens because an exuberant altruism is cultivated, which is not real, but only inevitably and unconsciously played out with the aim of calming one's own bad conscience, because even financially, socially and in terms of wealth, and so on, one is in a better position than those in need. It is also not uncommon, however, for motives to be based on a great need for recognition and acceptance. It also happens that the human beings who are so altruistically helpful have an unstable self, which they try to strengthen through their altruistic helpfulness by imagining that they are big, strong and good, which is why they are needed by other people, but this is only self-deception. Furthermore, behind some of this helpfulness there is too much of imaginary empathy and false altruism, such as I said, feelings of guilt, which are elevated by helping. It is also possible that there is a pathological imagination or even a profound delusion that one's own success is at the expense of others, that one's own happiness and satisfaction is undeserved and therefore an appropriate penance must be paid in the form of helpfulness. To be altruistic and therefore unselfish is an inner urge, a natural impulse of creation, which is the most valuable thing the human beings can realize in connection with their fellow human beings. But it is also true for altruism that at most a maximum may be done and this may not be exceeded, because otherwise it will have an extremely damaging effect in the long run. Thus, the human beings must always find their own justifiable and realizable optimum in order not to harm themselves. Quite simply, this means that the real altruist must control himself in his altruistic measure in order not to harm himself or even destroy himself. So it has to be found out how to find the balance between selfless empathy and necessary self-interest. Basically, there are different types of altruism, according to which selfish behavior can be absolutely altruistic, as for example, when in a dangerous situation the self-protection of the altruistic human beings is considered and implemented as the first measure. In this sense, altruism is an egoistic form, the so-called ethical egoism, which, however, contains a healthy value. Therefore, the concept of egoism does not have the negative meaning that is unfortunately generally assumed due to lack of understanding. If a human being is altruistic in a purely positive and not degenerate sense, then he always cultivates the interests of his fellow human beings in his thoughts and feelings and, if necessary, even puts them before his own if it becomes necessary. Altruism is therefore in no way a sacrifice of one or more human beings to ensure the survival of one or more human beings. Altruism can never be forced, because if it were, it would lose its altruistic character. Consequently, it can be seen from this that the altruistic behavior of the human beings is an absolutely voluntary behavior and, accordingly, a voluntary, altruistic action as well as a completely free decision, just as it is not aimed at any personal gain, utility or profit. Furthermore, it must be said that altruism is not only a human phenomenon, but that it is also present in animals and all living things, and even in bacteria and plants, which indicates that it is an urge of a creative natural form which is predetermined in practically all living things. However, this urge can only manifest itself and become effective in the human beings when, as described above, the general well-being, all behaviors and all other prerequisites are fulfilled. This in turn means that altruism is not necessarily given willingly, morally, idealistically or normatively or as a compelling guideline, but as a component of a creative natural innate positive urge of every individual, whereby it is a factor that can also be inherited in all life forms. The moral altruist acts altruistically in a creative natural principled way, and in doing so an internalist morality is expressed, which is revealed in the voice of conscience and which demands altruistic action. This fact must not be misunderstood, however, and above all not that the altruist, who is strongly moralistic, is a moral apostle. The human being who acts altruistically with regard to justice for his fellow human beings, when it comes to helping them, when they are treated unjustly or suffer from unjust living conditions, also does not belong in the realm of the moral apostle. Basically, justice is a very high value of the human being and of society, according to which it is altruistically cultivated and advocated by many people, although an internalist social norm must be given. Well, it is a fact that some human beings, even if they are not altruistically motivated by internalist values, also act altruistically, usually because it is expected of them. Which motives play a role in this is secondary, because normally the motivation is to meet the expectations of fellow human beings or to behave according to a given social norm, or to fit into a legally or socially prescribed form, for example with regard to a punishable failure to provide assistance. With regard to altruism, there is the so-called supererogatory action, which goes beyond the observance of expectations, laws, duties or regulations, and so on, which is considered extraordinary and is considered to be true altruism. By supererogatory action is meant that it is carried out outside of any moral obligation, or which is neither obligatory nor forbidden. If the act is omitted, it is not considered wrong, and it deserves neither criticism, sanction nor rebuke, either formally or informally. In principle, supererogatory action is morally good. This is so with regard to virtue and its intended consequences, as well as by virtue of the virtuousness of the intrinsic value which lies precisely outside duty, because it is carried out voluntarily and moreover, it is carried out honorably, for the benefit and well-being of one or more other human beings. Altruism can only be effectively distinguished in terms of good, selfless and calculating action. On the one hand, sympathetic altruism comes into its own, in which one acts in true unselfishness and there is an empathy or a willingness and ability to empathize with the attitudes of other human beings. On the other hand, egoism altruism appears, in which the egoist plays with selflessness and unselfishness in order to deceive one or more other human beings and to be able to gain, use and profit from it. If we look at all the forms of sympathy, we can see that not all of them require empathy, especially not things that are openly recognizable. This contrasts with hidden things and values, such as the high values of compassion and benevolence, which are unthinkable without empathic ability. A very important difference between moral or normative altruism and benevolence is that all benevolence is absolutely voluntary and not based on a shall. Acting according to principles and norms implicitly or implicitly carries with it the message that the human beings should also act in this way. In any case, benevolence is always an invitation for other people to align their thoughts, feelings, actions, deeds and behavior in the same framework. This, whereas moral altruism has a tendency to reproach others for their selfishness. On the other hand, the benevolent human being does not recognize personal selfishness, but is generous to all human beings in every way possible. An altruist who acts out of effective benevolence is broad-minded in this respect and includes all the human beings. His sphere of action therefore goes far beyond the narrow framework of kinship, neighborhood, friendship and acquaintance, so that he is a philanthropist.
Philanthropist is a term that comes from the ancient Greek anthropos and stands for the human beings and philosophically also for friend. A philanthropist is a philanthropist who not only likes other human beings, but also cultivates and shows his philanthropy in his daily life. In ancient times, philanthropic thinking, acting and behavior was derived from this term and was called philanthropy. Unfortunately, in modern times the precisely stated old meaning has changed to its detriment, as have many other precise terms which said exactly what is originally and really meant by them. Today, therefore, a philanthropist is understood to be the human beings who use their wealth for social projects, and so on, and as a result the value of philanthropy is defaced and misinterpreted. The fact is that the philanthropist really likes the human beings and puts them in a position of their own, and therefore also sees and treats them from this perspective. He does not take gender, race or skin color into account, because they do not matter to him. Thus, the relationship, attitude and behavior between the philanthropist and the human beings are not understood in terms of cost-benefit considerations. Effectively, he does not assume, even if he may be rich, that he has to act as a patron, sponsor or do-gooder for the sake of his reputation, impression and image with regard to poor people or well-known institutions and organizations, but his motives are solely based on the philanthropist's friendliness towards human beings and the love he feels and shows for them from within. Philanthropy is therefore never designed to gain profit and benefit in a personal way, such as to make a name for oneself as a benefactor and so on, through only alleged and apparent philanthropic do-gooder actions, and to appear in a bright light in public. Well, philanthropy need not, of course, be limited to an individual human being, but it can also be exercised by a group of human beings, an organization, an institution or a state, provided that the human beings transfer the philanthropic actions, views and behaviors to them and are exercised by them in a humane manner. Of course, this must not result in any directly related benefit, as is the case with aid organizations, which usually rake in millions of euros through begging letters and other begging activities and then pocket up to 40% or more as expenses. Of course, this has neither an altruistic nor a philanthropic sense, but only a false appearance, a bitter taste of commercialism driven by begging and self-enrichment through the begging of well-to-do organizers. From the state's point of view, the opposite of the aid organizations can very well be the case: an altruistic philanthropic system which is aimed at officially cultivating human dignity and philanthropy, for example, in such a way that a roof over one's head and all the necessary necessities of life are provided or finally given to the poor, the needy and the homeless, without any direct or symbolic consideration being demanded in return. This has indeed been common practice in various countries for quite some time, although in Europe, especially in Italy and the Scandinavian countries, it has been established that poor, sick and suffering fellow human beings are given all necessary care and attention by the state. In this way, many philanthropic views and actions were adopted, such as those relating to the care of the needy. However, this kind of altruistic philanthropic approach can be adopted by the human beings in their everyday life, for which there are many opportunities and possibilities. Thus, every human being can be a philanthropist, an altruistic philanthropist, and thus a person who not only likes other human beings, but who also shows this philanthropy in his daily life by showing kindness and compassion for his fellow human beings. Of course, a distinction must be made between goodwill and compassion, because they are two completely different forms of action on the part of one and the other. So the whole thing has to be defined, whereby it turns out that if the human being sees through the connection of all beings, he is then incapable of egoism, because he realizes that every suffering he inflicts on another human being or another living being sooner or later hits back at himself in some way. In principle, there is no difference between the human being and the other human beings as human beings, but only in terms of thoughts, feelings, opinions, views, psyche, actions, deeds, and behavior. Consequently, it is so that if the human being meets another human being benevolently and treats them in a supportive manner, he also does this for himself. If a definition of altruism is based on the assumption that altruism is always associated with sacrifice, then this interpretation is fundamentally wrong, because as already explained, altruism has nothing to do with self-sacrifice and sacrificial behavior. Self-sacrifice and sacrifice can only be spoken of when, instead of true compassion, compassion is acted upon, because then a compassion comes to light, in which the thoughts and feelings of compassionate sacrifice take possession of the human beings and cause them to fall into the abyss of compassionate pain and agony. Thus, when acting out of compassion, one can speak unreservedly of sacrifice, because through identification with the suffering, pain and anguish, or distress and the eye of the other human being or of an animal or creature, everything is personalized, and consequently there is no longer any separation between one's own ego and the ego of the other human being. If, however, goodwill and compassion are abandoned, then a comprehensive, altruistic action is quite simply based on humanity, as well as on affection and general gratitude and a profound understanding of life. But in this way, altruistic action also relates to the whole of nature and its fauna and flora and even to the planet. Scavenger even today, female and male philosophers and ethicists and so on still argue about what altruism really is, what its forms and causes, what its effects and so on are, especially in relation to the human beings. And this is the case even though altruism is easy to explain and can also be understood by the layman. But the so-called learned minds of philosophy, ethics and psychology, according to their banal understanding, have to complicate everything incredibly, so that the normal person no longer understands it, because he does not understand the absurdities of the confused scholarly way of thinking and the language of the same kind. The fact that this often leads to strange blossoms and crazy comparisons which have nothing to do with effective altruism and its value is understandable on the one hand, but on the other hand it must also be asked wherein how far the one or other female and male gender of philosophers, ethicists, and altruism researchers and so on is involved. Understanding and reason are actually developed. Nevertheless, there are often acceptable and unacceptable, as well as false and incomprehensible, confusing and even ridiculous attempts to explain altruism, which try to make the altruistic right or bad understandable for the layman or are actually able to do so. And since the doctrinal explanations given so far explain the basic principles of altruism and the important parts, further explanations or a whole treatise should probably not be necessary.
Semias A Silver Star Center, 8th May 2014, 3:20 p.m. Billy.